Hi, I'm Leaf Seligman, and I'm delighted you've joined me for this session on restorative teaching. I'm here with my friend Balmeet Laskey, who's going to be in conversation with me today about restorative teaching. And one of the things that Balmeet and I do is we meet every Friday and we spend a chunk of time together reflecting on our respective practices and the work that we do together. So it felt fitting that Balmeet would join me as I reflect with all of you on what is restorative teaching and what makes teaching restorative. So thanks so much for being here with me, Balmeet.
Sure.
And I thought the best way to convey some of the lessons that I've learned that have helped me formulate what I call the elements of restorative teaching are to just share some stories from a case study, which is the course that I teach at Keene State College in southwestern New Hampshire. I have two sections of the course. I call them affectionately the 1 o'clocks and the 3 o'clocks. So each section has its own personality, as one might imagine, made up of about 20 students. And I refer as much as I can to the people I work with as my co-learners, because they absolutely are my teacher as much as I am theirs. And for me, that's probably the first tenet of restorative teaching, to enter with an understanding that every moment and every being we encounter is our teacher if we're open to the lesson. So before I dive into the stories, let me clue you in on how this will work. I'll share a series of stories, and in each story is embedded a lesson or two that came to me. And the stories follow the arc of the semester. So we'll begin at the beginning. The course that I teach is called Until We Reckon, and it's a first-year thinking and writing course. And this semester, I had the privilege of working with a man named Obie Weathers, who lives on death row in Livingston, Texas. And he's been down there in a 6x9 cell on death row. This is his 21st year in that condition. Obie provided the core midterm assignments for me, and also it was his writing, his memoir, and his artwork that we used as our primary texts in the course. And Obie was able to communicate through us. We had an intermediary who's a friend of Obie's, so the co-learners could write Obie letters, which our friend Lawrence would download and send to Obie, and then Obie would painstakingly type out letters to each individual co-learner, and then those would come electronically to Lawrence, who would then send them to me. So it was quite a lot of effort on Obie's part to communicate with all of the learners as he did. So that's sort of the frame for the course, and really using his experience for me was the best way I knew to make real the realities of systemic racism, mass incarceration, and the importance of restorative practice. So that's kind of an overall frame for the course. So here's how the course started, day 1, fall semester 2021. We're assigned to an interior classroom in the college library with terrible ventilation, and I'm worried about COVID. Yes, the co-learners are masked, but they're also co-learners who are 18 and 19, and those masks were often below their nose. So I try to create a circle in the tiny space we have, because I use a circle as my core pedagogy. So I move the tables back, most of them, against the walls, and I form the best circle I can given the support beams. And in the center of the circle, and then often in a circle practice, there is a center, a focus, which might be kind of ceremonial. So I put 6 tables together in a rectangle that measured approximately 6 by 9 feet. And that was to represent the space that Obie has lived within for the last 21 years. The co-learners come in. Some of them are kind of loping like colts, and others are skittering like little crabs looking for crevices they can hide in. Most of them have not seen a circle in a classroom, and they don't know quite what to do with it. So they come in and they find their seats, and we pass the talking piece around, and we establish the kind of guidelines for our circle, how it works. And as we pass the talking piece to introduce ourselves, Jane gets the talking piece and she looks around the circle and says, "It appears I'm the only POC in the room, so I'm hoping that you'll understand that my lived experience is going to be different than yours, and I trust that you will respect that." And I'm instantly thinking, do they know what POC means? This is rural New Hampshire. And once in a while, I hear young people referring to colored people as opposed to people of color. But we proceed. Right away, Tom wants to know, after I explain about the 6x9 rectangle in the middle of the circle, well, what did Obie do? And I said, wait. We don't go to the worst thing a person has ever done. I said, you shared that you rap and you lay down beats. Obie meditates, Obie paints, Obie writes, Obie does a lot of things. So we keep going, and there's a lot of energy in the room, and it's pretty exciting for the first day. And I'm stoked that the 1 o'clocks are embracing the circle, and they're speaking up, and they're having a really good time. And the first class ends, and then the 3 o'clocks come in after they do, and it's a completely different story. They're very quiet in the circle, and they begrudgingly speak in monosyllables, and one fellow, Chris, works really hard to get behind that support beam so nobody can see him. And even when I ask him to sit forward, he sits back. And then, the second class meeting we have, the 1 o'clocks, Shayna wants to know, first thing out of the gate when she gets that talking piece, what did Obie do to end up on death row? And I said, oh gosh, I felt my body just clenching because I'm so protective of Obie. And I was so afraid as soon as I said something, she would judge him and others would judge him. And so I said, well, if you're asking why is Obie on death row, it's because he's poor and he's black. If you're asking what crime he was convicted of, that's a separate question. And right away, Jane, the person of color in the room, piped up and said, that's right, because when something happens in a white neighborhood, the police may not come. But when it happens in my neighborhood, they're right there. And to my surprise, Shayna said, yeah, I know all about it, because I've done some of those things and they haven't come. And they would be coming to your neighborhood, Jane, I know about that. And that was the first lesson I got, was that I was so worried that Shayna was trying to relegate Obie to his ignominy, to the worst thing that he'd ever done, but really she was just trying to find a point where she could relate with him. So that was the first lesson. Second lesson came at the end of the second class with the 3 o'clocks, when Chris was leaving the room, and I said, hey, may I talk to you for a minute? And he said, mm-hmm. And I asked him, I said, hey, are you really engaged in this course, or are you just in it because you need the credit and you signed up and you're here? And he said, yeah, I guess. And I said, well, I'm really looking for people who are all in. This is a really intense course, and it sounds like you might not be super engaged, so I think it would be better for both of us if you find another section. And to my surprise, that was a Wednesday, and the following Monday when we met for the third class, there was Chris in the room. I didn't say anything to him, but it turned out then he got sick shortly after that and ended up joining us on Zoom. And I noticed when we were Zooming that, again, he didn't say much of anything, but by the time the co-learners wrote their introductions to Obie, and I read all of their introductions, I noticed that Chris's was among the most thoughtful and respectful and inquisitive, and I thought, that doesn't add up with someone who would be disengaged. So I started emailing him back and forth, and it turned out that he said to me, I love this class, and I love writing, and I'm just really shy. And it hit me when he came back to class or when he was on Zoom that his monotonal and monosyllabic speech pattern was just about his speech pattern, and it had nothing to do with his level of engagement. And that was the second lesson I learned, and maybe the third and the fourth, which was not to judge people, but to be curious, and also to have the humility to acknowledge when I was wrong, because I sent him an apology, and I said, I'm so sorry, I was mistaken, I mistook what was a kind of, your reticence for a lack of engagement. And he said, well, I'm really glad we're on the same page, because this is my favorite class. And I was able to actually share that story with the co-learners as a story about myself and about how easy it is to make an assumption and get it wrong. So that first couple of classes, 3 or 4 classes, really gave me a handle on some core lessons that I needed.
So I have some questions.
Sure.
And I don't actually think in all of our times together we've ever actually talked about this specific thing. how hard was it for you to write back to him and say, you know what, I misjudged you?
How hard? Well, I don't know, on a scale of 1 to 5, it might have been a 2.5. Like, it wasn't really hard, but there was a part of me that thought, oh boy, I got that wrong. And then I thought, acknowledge it, because that, again, is such a core piece of restorative practice. To just acknowledge that, hey, I misread you. And that was actually really liberating, because then it gave him the opportunity to offer me some grace. And to be so gracious with his, I'm so glad we're on the same page, Leaf. And so it really rehumanized both of us in a way that if I hadn't apologized, he would have continued on in the course, but I don't think we would have had the same rapport. So it was really, it was well worth the effort to do that. And it felt important to tell the co-learners, because I really want to model for them that it's absolutely human to make mistakes, and we're all going to do it. And that what we can do, though, is, again, we can acknowledge and think about what is it I can do to make amends. And it felt like part of the amend wasn't just saying to him, I misjudged you. It was acknowledging to other people, you know what, I slipped into misjudging, and I'm asking that we all be a little bit more attentive when we do that. So, as you know, Balmeet, from our conversations, the sort of 4 verbs that I depend on are notice. What do we notice? What do I notice about what's going on in my body? What do I notice about what might be going on with you, with the other people in the room? Then that leads me to, what do I wonder? What am I curious about? And I think initially I failed to be curious about Chris. I misread his sort of tucking behind the post, because I've had a lot of co-learners in my life who very much want to hide. And I wasn't curious enough in the beginning, and I wasn't curious enough about the way that he spoke, sort of with such a flat affect. And it really wasn't until I was able to go, wait a minute, I know something about, certain folks and the way their brains are wired. They just have a particular speech pattern, and maybe that's a part of it. So it was really important to be able to just notice and wonder, and then acknowledge. Again, acknowledge where I had misstepped, acknowledge what was true for him, acknowledge how happy I was to have someone in the class who said, I really enjoy writing, I'm excited about this class. And then to appreciate. And that's the 4th verb. And I always say to the co-learners, appreciate kind of has dual meanings. Appreciate might mean I appreciate as in I'm super grateful for. And it might mean I appreciate and then I understand more deeply. So if you say, I really found that hurtful, and I say, I appreciate you telling me that, it's really not like, hey, I'm grateful that that was hurtful to you, but I am grateful that you shared that with me. I'm saying, I hear you and I understand more deeply. So those are the 4 verbs that we really try to use all the time. Notice, wonder, acknowledge, appreciate. As you may remember, Balmeet, I was so jazzed about the 1 o'clocks. They were on fire. And the 3 o'clocks were so sleepy. I was just kvetching nonstop on our walks about the 3 o'clocks and why won't they talk? So I did what I know to do, which is to wonder and to be curious. So in the 3rd class session, I asked the 3 o'clocks at the end of the class, because I felt like I was really pulling teeth, and I said, hey, I don't have a degree in dentistry. I don't want to keep pulling your teeth. I need your help. So I'm asking you, what do you all need to feel like you can engage more fully with the course? And I'm just curious, like, what's going on for you? So I sent the talking piece around the circle, and everybody spoke. They spoke succinctly, but they spoke, and it was sort of a variation on several themes. The course material is so heavy, which it is. We don't know each other, which was true. We don't trust each other, also true. And even though that might have been true for the 1 o'clocks, it was just a different mix of people. And in the 3 o'clock section, there were just quieter people. And so I said, okay, well, what would you like to do about that? And several of them said, well, the circle is scary, and we don't really like the circle. And I told them, I'm not willing to give it up entirely because it's the core pedagogy I use, but I'm willing to suspend it for a little while. So it sounds like, and I'm practicing a little reflective listening with them, it sounds like I'm hearing you say that if we could work in pairs or trios or small groups for a while so that you got to know each other a little bit better, and then you could build some community and some trust, then it might be more reasonable to step into the full class circle. And they agreed. And I have to say that it was slow going, but at least we proceeded, and in small groups they were more amenable to participating with each other. So it seemed like things were on a pretty good roll. But it didn't stay on the easy track. Because class number 4, the 1 o'clocks, who I could always count on to participate in a lively way, we're having a really great discussion. The talking piece is traveling around the circle, and I don't remember exactly what the topic was, but I know what it was not. We were not actually talking about sexual assault, but for whatever reason, Shana got the talking piece, and she chose to divulge her own experience being sexually assaulted during high school by her best friend's brother, and she went into some detail, nothing graphic, but it was pretty detailed for people for whom that might be a trigger. And as she's sharing her story, Tom says, "I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I am, because I find this really uncomfortable, and I don't see the purpose of this at all. I don't, what are we, just telling sad stories now? I mean, really?" He said, "I'm sorry, I just have to leave. I have to excuse myself." And I nodded and said, "Okay." And he politely walked out. So I looked at the rest of the folks and I said, "Would anyone like to answer Tom's question? What is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this?" And there was a beat or two, and I said, "I know that as the circle keeper, I'm choosing to allow, it's not up to me to decide what goes on, but I in my time and space, have not interrupted and decided that this was important, but I'm curious, what do you all think? Why are we doing this?" And finally, Shana was the one who said, "I'll tell you why it's important that we do it. It's important because people like me need to be heard. And too often, girls and young women get silenced, and we aren't believed, and we don't get a chance to talk about it. And it's really important to break that silence." And then the talking piece went around, and Tom rejoined us maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes later, and he came in the classroom and he just stood against the wall. And I waited until the person with the talking piece finished her share, and then I said, "Okay, can we just pause on the talking piece and welcome Tom back into the circle, and does anyone want to fill in Tom on what happened?" And again, there was kind of a pause, and then finally I said, "Well, here's what Shana shared about what was important." And he started to apologize. And I said, "Please don't, because you didn't do anything wrong. In fact, you modeled being accountable, and you did what you needed to take care of yourself. You were not disrespectful to someone else." And that's a really important lesson that all of us are learning here, is that the truth is messy, that it's complicated, that one person's truth is not another's, that one person's need is not always in alignment with someone else's. Shana really needed to speak her truth in this moment, and Tom, you really needed to excuse yourself for whatever reason, and that's okay. And teaching restoratively requires us to be willing to sit in the complicated, messy space of being human together, and being able to wade into that uncertainty, and knowing that none of us, no matter how gifted or experienced we are, can always read the room, although part of restorative teaching, I think, is having the humility to say, "I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my best to read the room, and if I get it wrong, which I well might, I can also acknowledge that and create space to say there are multiple truths." And one of the things that I talk with co-learners about all the time, and I think you and I talk about too, is the both and. That it's not either or, that either Shana was right or either Tom's right. Both things were true. He needed to step out, she needed to speak her truth. And I found out later, at the end of the semester, when I read the co-learners' self-assessments about their own work and their experience in the course, one of the young women in the course wrote about that class and said on that day she seriously thought about not coming back to the class because that was so triggering for her. And she was mad at Shana for speaking up and telling that story. And she took the opportunity over the intervening months to really reflect on why. And what she came to understand about herself was that when she had experienced sexual assault as a young woman in high school, she hadn't felt that she could tell the story. She hadn't felt that anyone would listen to her. And when she heard Shayna in class and she saw this cloud of witnesses, this classroom of people witnessing, listening, acknowledging, and validating Shayna, she resented it. And she wished that she could have had that experience. And what I want to say is that if I had shut down that conversation as the instructor, which, to be honest, a lot of instructors might have done. At the moment Shayna starts revealing this personal story, I can imagine myself in an earlier time and place or a colleague saying, hey, not now, not the right time, shutting it down. Not only would that have a deleterious effect on Shayna, and I think Tom, but also the young woman who had that opportunity to reflect on her own experience. And then over the course of the semester, the fact that she was able to reflect and say, wow, I was resentful in the moment in class because my classmate was able to do something and receive something that I had not. And then she realized that she didn't want to leave the class at all. What she wanted to do was try to help create a world where she could break her own silences. And fast forward several weeks later in the course, I'll tell a little story about her project that the young people did a project called an embodied engagement project. And when that young woman chose to do a project, she chose to break the silence about her own mental illness and living with one. And I don't think she might have done it had it not been for that earlier experience. So for me, that just is a great lesson in not just humility, but also this kind of radical trust that sometimes what's messy and might even seem triggering is an opportunity for growth. And we never know how it's going to roll. I only know that to shut it down closes the door on learning.
So I hear a couple lessons here that you went through. The truth is messy, right? And one that you didn't explicitly say, but I think needs to be said, and it's so simple that I think we forget it, and that's each according to each learner's needs, right?
Absolutely.
And so that was the difference between the 1 o'clock session and the 3 o'clock session, but also between all the individual learners in that 3 o'clock lesson or 3 o'clock class example that you just gave. And particularly with the woman who had the big reveal in her embodied project, right? Her needs took a long time to unfold, and shutting things down would have really unwittingly neglected her needs. Right?
Absolutely.
Right. So one thing you haven't spoken about that I know you do is you make people stay in their bodies.
Well, I invite them to.
Okay. Yes, and you model it. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I think that's a key piece
Sure.
to why the reflective practice happens with these students these co-learners, in your class and
Right.
on their own.
Absolutely. Thanks for reminding me of that, because I forgot to say the way we begin every class, and I started this during the pandemic when I was teaching solely on Zoom, and now, of course, in the class I'm describing, I'm teaching in person, although there are always some co-learners on Zoom, so it's a hybrid situation. We always start the opening query with, do you have any tender spots? And that really is an invitation to pause, to quiet ourselves, to do kind of a body scan. Do I have any tender spots? And I explained in the beginning, a tender spot might be physical, actually, or it could also be emotional. And what I love most, Balmeet, is that even though a lot of times the co-learners would say, no, I don't have any, over the course of the semester, I could see the pause, and I could see that folks were actually taking the time to check in with themselves and check in with their bodies. And it wasn't a kind of just sort of reflexive, no, I don't want to. It was a, no, I don't think I have any tender spots today, Leaf. Or, well, maybe, I'm feeling really stressed about the amount of work I have to do. Or, my tender spot is that I'm in quarantine for COVID. Or my tender spot is that because of COVID, I haven't been able to see my friends. And so it really is a wonderful invitation to just be in the body. And the other piece is that for me, tenderness is sort of the watchword of my faith. And I always talk about that we can be tender with each other and how important it is to be tender with each other. And so if folks, if 2 or 3 folks said, yes, actually I have a tender spot, or I had a tender spot, I always, shared with them if I did, that we would take a moment and just send a little light or a good thought or some energy to the folks in our midst who had tender spots. And even just that too. Sometimes we would just take a moment to breathe together and say, okay, so there's a lot of heaviness in the room right now. So let's just breathe. And we talked about ways that we could regulate our bodies. If people needed to do that, if they needed to get up, if they needed to shake their hands for 10 seconds like that. We talked about if they needed to do the lion's breath, or if they needed to go do a push-up on a wall. And we had one of the co-learners in my 1 o'clock class has a chronic illness, and a lot of times, just due to the specificity of her condition, she needed to lie down on the floor. And sometimes she needed to raise her hands above her head. And so having her in the classroom was really a beautiful invitation to all of us to just honor that every body is different, and that there was space for her. And again, I can imagine that she probably encountered other, I'm sorry to say it, but probably other professors and other learning situations where she was not just able to lie down on the floor and, speak from the floor and carry on. And I can imagine a lot of people might be like, hey, listen, if you can't sit up, what are you doing lying down on the floor? And she just often would announce it. And in fact, one day in class, Shayna helped assemble her wheelchair that she was so excited that she got a wheelchair, and it came in a big box, and she got it from the mailroom, and Shayna was super excited to put it together in the middle of the room. And it was just, again, a moment and an acknowledgement that we are embodied creatures. So, yeah, that feels really important, an important part of restorative practice. I was so deeply moved by the vulnerability of the 1 o'clocks and the way they could really sit in that messy both and, that I left class that day. This was only the 4th week of class. And I thought, I gotta do something for these guys. I love them so much. And because we had COVID and the masks and the protocols, I couldn't bring in a plate of cookies like I might have done previously. So I went to the local coffee shop, my favorite place, and I bought each co-learner a $5 gift certificate, which would buy them a good cup of fancy coffee or a really good treat. And I painstakingly wrote out their names on each little gift certificate. And the following Monday, I presented them, and I told them, in 30 years of teaching, I've never done this. I have never bought the co-learners a gift card. And I presented the gift cards, and they were touched, I think. And of course, by the end of the class, I'm thinking, I hope nobody says anything to the 3 o'clocks, because I didn't buy any for them. And I was hoping that I would get to the place where I could authentically feel that big wave of love that compelled me to drop $100 on gift cards. And I thought, I need to wait though until I really feel it, because I don't want to do it in a way that feels inauthentic. And I have to say that by week 6, the 3 o'clocks were in a big circle. And when we passed the talking piece and everybody participated, I said, look at us. Look at how far we've come. We're all in a circle and we're passing the talking piece. And you guys are saying really brave and vulnerable stuff. And it was really this lovely moment. And so then after that class, I went and I got them gift certificates. And then the next class, I presented them the gift certificates. And so all of that was really quite a wonderful sense of accomplishment. And, because there's always an and, there's a both and an and, it was also about this time that I was just getting so crabby. My housemates were noticing that I was super stressed out, mostly around COVID. Those masks were half the time down here, and I was just really worried, even though we moved to a bigger room. And I was so frustrated with the hybrid teaching, because there would always be at least one co-learner on Zoom, sometimes 2 or 3, and maybe 4, sometimes 5, cameras on, cameras off, and just the way that the cameras in the classroom were positioned in order to be able to speak to the people on Zoom. I felt like I needed to run and stand in front of the computer monitor, even though really, given where the camera was focused, that probably didn't help. It was hard for the co-learners on Zoom, couldn't always hear what the folks in class were saying. And it was just, it wasn't, I couldn't pay attention to the people in class because I needed to check the responses of the co-learners, and if they typed into the chat, I was squinting, but I couldn't really read it, so I had to go to the monitor, and I'm running around, and all of this is just accruing inside of me, and I'm getting crankier and crankier and crankier. So, not a surprise, one day in class, this fella has his phone out and he's kind of scrolling, and I'm really cranked out about that. And then I notice these two young women over here in the circle, and they seem to be chit-chatting with each other, and the talking piece is going around, and I just bark, and I'm like, hey, Gavin, what are you doing with your phone? You need to put it up. Why are we having a side conversation over here? And immediately that barking extinguished the behaviors. He puts up his phone, the two young women sort of look sort of like they've been scolded, and we carry on. And I notice in my body this really sinking feeling, like I am so out of alignment with my values. And I just felt icky, 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 icky. And we kind of kept going. But that night I thought, oh, that was just unacceptable belief. And I was also able to offer myself some tenderness, because I figured out that there I had barked at those three co-learners because they weren't paying absolute attention to the person who had the talking pieces that moved around the circle. And that bothered me so much because I wasn't able to pay attention to any of them in an unmixed, focused way. And so, again, the next class I went in, and in the opening circle when we talked about tender spots, I said I'd actually like to begin with my tender spot, and I'd like to apologize to everyone in the section. This was 3 o'clock. And I said, I really need to apologize for the way I behaved. And I said, I'm guessing that some of you didn't even notice it because unfortunately you're so used to being spoken to that way by people in authority or professors, and it's totally unacceptable. And I said, I'm asking for your help. Like, I'm responsible for my behavior, and if I slip into that again, and I hope I don't, I invite you to ask me into accountability, because I'm telling you right now that is not acceptable behavior. That is not how we want to speak to one another. And the big shift that happened for me, Balmeet, with that is that I stopped, like I was able to stop being so judgmental and making an assumption like, hey, Gavin has his phone out and that means he's being disrespectful, or he doesn't think that what we're doing in class matters, and those two young women are chatting because they don't value their peers. And I thought, leave, be curious. Wait a minute. And then I started wondering and thinking, wow, these are young people this is the second year of the pandemic. They're not able to see their friends and family the way they're used to doing. They're not able to socialize on a college campus the way they were sort of promised in high school, when you go off and you live on campus and you hang out and you have parties and you can get together in the dorm room. And, you know, they're worried about family members. They're worried about all the other stuff that young people worry about. And then I softened. And so what shifted is that if in class I saw someone doing something, like I noticed Gavin would get up and leave the class. Almost every class he would excuse himself. He'd just get up and walk out, be gone for a few minutes and come back. And so I was curious, and I said, hey, I didn't ask him in front of class. I asked him sort of when we were having a little break. I said, I noticed that you'd get up and leave class quite a bit, and I'm just curious about that. And he said, oh yeah, I just find it really difficult to sit still for an hour and 45 minutes. Like my body just can't tolerate it. So sometimes I just need to get up and move around. And I said, oh, well, that is really helpful, and I bet you're not the only person. So in the 3 o'clock class, often we instigated a little 5-minute bio break halfway through. And the 1 o'clocks didn't seem to need it, but in that class, it was just helpful to be curious. And then another time I saw a young woman, and she had her phone out, and she looked like she was texting. And again, not in a way to shame her or make her feel terrible. I just said, hey, I'm curious. I noticed you have your phone out, and I'm just wondering if there's an unmet need that you want to meet and what you would need for that. And she said, oh yeah, I was just texting my mother. And I thought maybe what really mattered in that moment was that she needed to feel connected to her mother. And if that was the most important need for her, I would want her to be able to honor it. And so I just suggested and said, hey, if you need to do that, maybe you could, if you want to, you can excuse yourself, or you might want to let others know, just so that we're aware that that's something that you need to do, and it's not in any way a signal that you're tuning out what other people are saying. And so that was really helpful. That was a big shift for me in terms of my own capacity to notice, to wonder, to acknowledge what was going on inside of me, and be curious and acknowledge what was going on for other folks, and then just to appreciate that we all have needs, and that any behavior that any behavior is simply an attempt to address an unmet need, and the best way that we know how in the moment. So that was really important.
So I have a question. You also softened over the course of time about how you felt about this course in relationships to other courses, you know, the standard curriculum or what your colleagues would think. And also, a lot of times you would say to me, I've thought about this and I've been worried about it. Am I really teaching them how to write? And I always come back to, this is what they really need right now in this place and time. So
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I feel like that was a big shift for me. Because as I said, I've been teaching college writing or some variation of it since 1985. And it's sort of been drilled into me in different comp rep programs or people that I've worked with. You know, they need to know how to write the 12 to 15 page research essay with X number of scholarly peer-reviewed sources and use APA or MLA format and blah, 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 blah. You know, and as I spent time with these young people, we actually had a mid-semester essay, which you very generously came in and helped us with. And we also had this research essay, which is sort of the culminating piece of work for this introductory thinking and writing course. And it really did shift, because when we got to the last about 6 weeks of the semester, I'll backtrack in a little bit and talk a little bit about the project that we did. But when we got to that research, sort of the time in the course where they would pick an issue that they wanted to reckon with. I'd already said, hey, I want you to reckon with mass incarceration, and I want you to reckon with anti-racism and racism and systemic oppression, and I want you to reckon with all these other things. Now you choose something you want to reckon with. And I was very clear this semester to say explicitly, you're not writing a research essay because I'm making you do it. It's an invitation. The college has an expectation that you will leave this course with this set of skills. And if that's important to your learning trajectory, then by all means I encourage you to use this time to develop, to cultivate, to practice those skills. And if that is not what is most central to your well-being, then that's for you to decide. Because I also, as you know, am using sort of what we might call democratic grading or ungrading, where the co-learners assess their own work and they tell me what letter grade they feel they've earned, because the college does require that I put a letter grade on a form at the end of the semester. And so what was really interesting is that even though I said, and I said it more than once, I'm not making you write this research essay. If you choose to engage in the process, I'm happy to work with you, and I showed them how to find sources, and we did that as a class. You know, we looked at databases that the college library had and blah, blah, blah. And what I found was that all of the co-learners chose to engage in that process. They chose to engage in it in different ways and at different levels. So we spent about 4 weeks of class just coming in, and people could work independently, they could work in clusters, and so often what would happen is 2 or 3 or 4 people would sit at a table. We'd always do our opening circle, and then they would kind of sit at a table together, and maybe 1 or 2 of the co-learners who really just work better independently, they're sort of sitting in a corner, they would actually say, would it be all right if I go back to my room and work, because I just do better in a quiet space or my own space. And that was fine. I said, absolutely, go do what you need to do. The Zoom learners, the same thing. It's like if you want to turn off your camera and do your work. What I noticed was that there was always a core group of learners who came, and that I think coming and being in community was as important as anything else. And just having that chance to be together. And I was really moved that there was one co-learner in the 3 o'clock class. She missed quite a lot of class, and she would always email ahead of time to say that she was taking a mental health day, that she was dealing with some serious family issues. And she came to class one day during that period of time we were working on the research project, and she was very clear that she hadn't, you know, sort of, she wasn't kind of where everybody else was sort of supposed to be, and she hadn't done any drafting yet. But she shared with me that her family, her parents had just moved from New Hampshire to Florida, that she was all alone in the state, that she was really struggling with a lot of emotional issues, and that it was really important to her that she would be making up her work, that felt important to her. She wanted to make up all her missed assignments, even though I said, that's completely up to you. You grade yourself. So there was no pressure from me, like if you don't make up those assignments, you won't get a good mark. She needed to do that for her. And that's so core to restorative teaching, that the co-learners have a sense of agency, that for once in their lives, someone says to them, what matters to you? What do you need to learn here? And what I feel like she really mastered was being able to identify when she did need to take time from her mental well-being, and that she had the agency. She always notified me and her other faculty ahead of time, and that she came and she just sought connection. She just wanted to be in that room with us. And what was really interesting is that everybody did what they did. And for instance, Shayna, who I talked about before, she chose to write about sexual assault, and she uploaded 2 pages. And I was sort of thinking, wow, 2 pages. In the old days, that would have been about 10 short. And so I wrote her back on the online platform, and I offered her some queries and invited her to reflect a little bit more and to think a little bit more deeply. And then she uploaded a 3rd page. And then I asked her how she felt about that. And she said she felt really good, that she'd covered what she needed to cover. And I had another co-learner in the same section who also wrote about sexual assault. She wrote that sort of classic research essay I'm sure you've seen in your day. 11 pages, several peer-reviewed articles, perfectly cited, excellent. You know, the kind of paper that in the old days would have been a big like, hey, awesome. And I thought, so she wrote that. Shayna wrote 3 pages. And Shayna was really pleased with her work, and in her final self-assessment, she wrote, I feel really good about what I did. I'm really proud of my writing. It's the best I've ever done. I feel so good about the friends I've made in this course, and I know that I am a better human being for taking this class. And I can't think of any better affirmation of what I was doing. Because as I tried to say to the co-learners, when the time comes that you need to write a research essay for an upper level course, you'll do it if you have to do it. And if you want to know how to do something that you haven't learned or you haven't practiced in this course, you'll learn, you'll practice it. Because the truth is there are really a lot of ways online to Google how do you write a research essay. And certainly I'm a good resource and I could help them, and some of them asked for help and some of them didn't. And what I got was what people uploaded, what people wrote, what people created mattered to them. And they got to decide what was satisfying to them as a learner. So it was really powerful. And that was another piece of the humility, to not presume that I know what anyone else needs, or how anyone else learns, or what someone needs to learn at this moment. And that's another really key piece, right, about restorative practice and restorative teaching, is that it exists in a context. This was not an ordinary time and place. This is year 2 of a pandemic, of a global pandemic. This is year 2 of a global pandemic, and something that I realized later that a colleague pointed out to me is this cohort of young people who are about 18 years old, 19 years old in 2021, now 2022, they're the cohort of folks that were doing active shooter drills in high school. And someone pointed out, this colleague pointed out to me, that these are young people who are literally taught as they were in those active shooter drills to look to the left and look to the right, because literally the kid next to them might be the person who in the next period came in with a semi-automatic and might threaten their lives. And that was real for them, that they've been living with that existential fear for the last 5, 6, 7 years. And now they're in a pandemic where literally they come in a classroom and they look to their left and they look to their right, and they don't know who might be transmitting COVID. That might infect them, that might kill them, that might give them COVID and they're okay, but they take it home to grandma. And that there's a level of anxiety, this kind of collective anxiety that is such a fevered pitch, no pun intended, that it really occurs to me that part of being restorative is being responsive and aware of that moment, and not, I hear so many of my colleagues going, this group of students in this cohort, they're so sensitive and they all have anxiety and they're all so depressed, and it really breaks my heart to hear that lack of empathy, because I understand that for my colleagues to express that lack of empathy suggests, perhaps, I wonder, it's a curiosity of mine, are they feeling under-resourced? Are they feeling under-acknowledged? Are they as stressed out about hybrid teaching as I am, and COVID as I am? Of course they are. I'm sure they are. And maybe the difference is I get to go into a classroom and talk about my anxiety and my frustration and my tender spots with 20 other people who share about theirs. And I think, sadly, some of my colleagues wouldn't dream of doing that. And so they're stuck in that really armored up, defended, anxious place that really gets in the way of empathy. So does that answer the question?
It definitely does.
Good. One thing I just want to circle back to before we draw to a close. So I mentioned the embodied engagement projects, and I just want to mention that to folks as a wonderful piece of restorative teaching. And I actually started doing this several years ago before I sort of thought about teaching restoratively in such explicit ways. But the idea is, as I said, I'm teaching this thinking and writing course where mostly the work of the course is to think, to write, to rewrite, to read. And I'm thinking, well, we're embodied beings. So how can I invite my co-learners to engage with material using their whole bodies in a more kinesthetic way? So I came up with this idea a few years ago, and basically I said, take a look at the course material, think about all the things that we've covered, and then try to engage with and in that material with the rest of your body. So for some of you, that might be something that feels sort of creative or artistic. It might be a drawing, it might be a painting, it might be a dance, it might be a short film. Or it could be a classroom activity, could be a simulation that you want to give us an experience of, some kind of emotional understanding. And this semester, Obi worked with me on that. And he had suggested, to help maybe folks think about the kind of burden we carry when we carry an unrevealed truth. There's a kind of inherent burden sometimes to carrying an unrevealed or unexpressed truth. And so he and I invited the co-learners to carry a stone. I gave them all a smooth, polished river rocks, and to carry one for about 6 hours in their non-dominant hand. And then just after that, journal about that experience, and then use that kind of as the basis of their EEP. What came up for you? What did you notice? What were you curious about? What did you wonder? What's something you could acknowledge about that experience, something you appreciate about it? And it was really wonderful. And in this presentation, I'll share some of the photos of some of the different artwork that people created. And what was so meaningful is that many of the folks who created a painting had never painted before or drew. These are not the kids who've taken studio art. These were kids who would very shyly say, I don't know how to draw, but I wanted to try to express this anyway. And it was just so moving. And then they would share their image if that's what they created, and then they would have a query to engage everybody. And there were a couple of folks who chose to do a classroom activity. And one was the young woman I mentioned earlier, who had this really beautiful classroom activity where she invited us through the exercise to really have some empathy for folks who move through the world with mental illness. And although she didn't choose to disclose the particular mental illness that she has, she wrote about that in her self-assessment and said it was her one regret, that she just didn't feel quite brave enough to be specific, but she was really proud that she was able to acknowledge that she lives with a mental illness. And what was really moving is that so many other of the co-learners in the class, when we passed that talking piece, acknowledged that they too live with some kind of mental illness or a mental health challenge. And it just was so transformative because people didn't have shame around it. And even this one particular young person who'd been so reticent, he was so quiet, and he said, I know I'm really quiet, and guys aren't supposed to be vulnerable about this, but it's really important to say as a guy that we have mental health problems too, and we need to get help. And I thought that happened because she felt empowered to do that. And another young man felt that he really wanted to share that he's part of a kind of, I guess he would call it a lifestyle, and that's often misunderstood. I had never heard of it, so it was news to me. And it's called furries. You can Google it. And it's an appreciation for kind of an anthropomorphic relationship with animals, and sometimes it has to do with wearing animal costumes or animal, I don't know if costume is quite the right word, but I'm going to use that for lack of a better word. Anyway, he just asked people a series of questions about their relationships to animals and with animals and animal qualities in themselves. And he used that opportunity to share a little bit about the fact that this is a kind of way of being in the world and that he participates in it and that sometimes people are really hostile towards it. And it was just an extraordinarily brave thing, for a 19-year-old young man to do. And I feel like offering people the space to express themselves in non-linear, non-sort of rational ways also felt really important. And it was another lesson I learned. The last thing I'll say is there was one exception. There was one person who didn't write a research essay. Because when we talked about it, as she was explaining what she wanted to investigate, she really had trouble articulating it with words. And I said, hey, I'm noticing that it seems like you're having a hard time putting into words and putting on paper your thoughts. Is that a common experience for you, a familiar experience for you? And she said, oh yeah, it's been like this my whole life. And I said, would it be fair to say that spoken language and written language is not your mother tongue? And she said, yes. And I said, what's your first language? And she said, dance. I've been dancing since I was 3. And what was really lovely is that she taught me in that moment, right, we don't, each according to their own needs. That part of, for me, what feels so oppressive about the academy, in fact, is the way that there's this kind of hierarchy of learning, and that to think critically is super important in the world. And it's not, and to think rationally, and that's not the only way that we learn. And the only way of learning isn't always through the written word, and it isn't through peer-reviewed articles. And so it was really lovely. I asked her what she would like to do, and I asked her if she'd be interested in choreographing a dance, because that's her mother tongue, and that's what she opted to do. And what she really wanted to reckon with was ableism in dance. And to take that concept of ableism, which is this, in dance, there's nothing more embodied than dance. So actually words would be the most inappropriate way I can imagine coming about if you want to investigate, well, what happens when we have ableism in dance, and how do we reckon with the fact that dance has all these rules about what kinds of bodies and what kinds of movement, and what happens when we break those down and include dancers who have all kinds of bodies and all kinds of ways of moving in their bodies. And what better way to explore that than to dance? And she did. She choreographed a dance which she performed herself and was really proud of. And I felt so awesome that I got to invite her into that space, and that she taught me. And so this semester I've made clear that any invitation, any assignment, which is an invitation, I always say all assignments are invitations, not obligations, but I always say, if I give you an invitation in a particular form and you know that it's not in your mother tongue, tell me what tongue you'd like to use. Tell me what form you want to use. And, even though most young people are, more likely to stay in the lane and turn in something written, it feels really important to invite them into the possibility that there are other ways of knowing. So I would say that also feels like a super important lesson of restorative teaching that Hannah taught me.
So one thing that we didn't talk about that is super important is the resistance or the shyness to attempt this as a teacher. There needs to be a certain amount of courage before you commit to this, or maybe people think that's great, you can do that in a college writing course, but like you've said before, I teach chemistry, how can I do it? So can you speak to that?
Sure. So one thing I would say is that restorative practice is just a way of being in the world, and each according to their needs. So some of us are going to feel more comfortable diving into the deep end of a swimming pool, and some of us are going to wade into the shallow end. And the truth is, some of us might hang out in the baby pool for a while and acclimate, and all of that is fine. So what I would say to the person who's teaching at the college or university level, maybe say a chemistry course or hard sciences, who feels like, that's fine for the humanities, but really, in the 5 minutes it might take you to go around the room, I know you probably aren't going to arrange your chairs in a circle, although kudos to you if you try. You can still go up and down the rows and ask about tender spots and exuberances. I've added that because it's lovely to give people a chance to inhabit and claim their joy. But even that 5 minutes, or even 3 at the beginning of a class, will make a huge difference. One of the things my co-learners have said to me is this is the only course where we know each other's names, where we're expected to learn each other's names. And that builds community because we all want to be recognized and have a name. And so I think just even making the time for that is super important. So what I would say is, at the university level, even if it's just tiny incremental little baby steps, that still matters. And even if you're doing everything the way you've always done it and you're in the front of the class lecturing with your notes or whatever it is, you can still invite humility. You can still read the room. You can still notice if your co-learners feel engaged and think about and be curious about if they look like they're zoning out. I hear my colleagues say about learners on Zoom, they turn their cameras off, they're zoning out, they're not listening. And I never hear anyone, I've not yet heard a colleague say, I wonder why, I'm curious. Mm-hmm. And I rarely hear a colleague say, is it possible that I'm doing something that might be boring the hell out of them? Mm-hmm. And I think that humility is really useful. So I would say, even if what we do is just be more curious and notice what's going on in ourselves, and then be curious about that, and then the next step would be to acknowledge, and then maybe start with some appreciation for where we're coming from and where our co-learners are coming from. That's the beginning of a paradigm shift. Thinking of people as co-learners, not students, is a huge paradigm shift. That's a place to start. So I would really say to my colleagues at the university level, just begin by noticing, wondering, acknowledging. Begin with yourself. It's an inside job, for sure. Like there's no way, and so what I would say, there's no way, the end of that sentence is there's no way to go into a classroom or any other work situation and offer to other people what we don't have as a resource for ourselves. So if you as a colleague feel like you are lacking tenderness in your life, it's going to make it really hard to offer it to the people in the room with you. So then part of the work of restorative teaching before you even step foot in the class is saying outside of the class, how can I better resource myself? What do I need? Where's the tenderness in me? And how can I meet it with tenderness? What does self-compassion look like for me? So I would say that inner work is the first step before anything changes in the classroom. And what I would say to colleagues who might teach K through 12, and I understand that there's a lot of pressure to teach to the test, there's certain standards, kids need to read at this grade level, at this age, and da-da-da-da, and do we really have time for all the touchy-feely stuff and the circle stuff? A quick reminder that human beings are hardwired for touch, and if you remember Harry Harlow's experiment, right? The little monkeys cling to the cloth monkeys because touch is more or as important as nutrition. So when we are dismissive and we use language like, oh, that's touchy-feely, what we're really dismissing is our humanity and our connection actually to mammalian world. And that's super important to remember. So I would say the same thing to folks who are teaching K through 12. Start with your inside, start with your own inner work. How do you resource yourself? Start with connecting in whatever way you can with your co-learners. And just because they're 6 or 7 or 8 and you're 30 or 40 or 50 or 60, they're your teachers too. So I think everybody's a co-learner. So I would really invite my colleagues at any level to just kind of do an inventory of self first and say, okay, be curious. If you feel resistant, if you listen to this and go, great for you, Leaf, you and Balmeet, you just keep doing that, but I'm not doing that stuff. Great, be curious about that. Where's the resistance coming from? Be tender with yourself. What is it that makes that feel really scary for me or threatening to me or uncomfortable for me? We didn't really talk about the fact that part of what restorative teaching asks us to hold is that discomfort is not the same as danger. Mm-hmm. And that there are many people, especially people of color, in the country I live in the United States and across the world, who do experience danger, literal danger in a classroom. And there are many of us, like me, who are white, who experience discomfort and confuse it for danger. And I think part of what we can do is decenter comfort, especially for those of us who live in privilege and live in comfort, and be able to do it tenderly. And so for an educator to say, this makes me uncomfortable to try something new, to have morning circle, or to share a little bit about my day. I mean, I had a student, or a co-learner rather, literally, I had a co-learner wait half an hour after class while I was talking to one of her colleagues to say to me, thank you so much for sharing your tender spot with us today. That really changed my life. I've never seen a professor do that. So wow, we have the capacity to change someone's life by sharing a tender spot. That's a pretty awesome return on what we do. So I would say, breathe into the discomfort if you have it, and try it anyway.
And find somebody to work with.
And find somebody to work with. Absolutely, find your pod, find your equivalent, find your reflective partner, because that's super important to have a reflective partner, someone who can, or reflective partners who can work with you. So that's the other thing I would say, absolutely, thank you for that, is to find other folks who are engaging in this work and, ask for their support. And yeah, be not afraid. Or be afraid and do it anyway. Well, this has been fun for me, and I hope it's been helpful for those of you listening. And just as we wrap up, I want to say that my wonderful friend Michelle Stowe, who's also a presenter, taught me the phrase relational pedagogy. And I think that's the best summation of restorative teaching I can think of. Because if relationship is at the center of our pedagogy, then we know we're on the right track. Because really, everything that happens in the classroom and outside of it is about relationship. And if you take nothing else from this, I hope that what all of us will do is just do that pause and check in with ourselves and ask, hey, is how I'm being in this moment bringing me into right relationship with my core values, with how I want to be in the world, with the kind of world I want to be in? And I think that is the simplest way for me on a daily basis just to know, am I doing this restoratively or not? So I thank you all for your really kind attention, and I have tried to distill the elements of restorative teaching into 19 points, which will show up on your screen, and you're welcome to take a screenshot of it and distribute or use it at will. So thanks again for spending this time with me, and may all your teaching be restorative.